March 26, 1943. A military hospital in Semmering, Austria. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat propped up in bed, exhausted, ill-defeated by his own body before the Allies could defeat him in battle. A letter had arrived that morning, from his staff officers still fighting in Tunisia. The news it contained made him set down his coffee and read it twice. The Americans had changed. 3 weeks earlier, at Kasserine Pass, Rommel had torn through American lines like paper. Green troops, incompetent officers, tanks that ran the wrong direction. He had written to his wife Lucy that the Americans were no threat, that they lacked the warrior spirit. Now those same Americans had stopped a German panzer assault cold at a place called El Getter. They had anticipated every move, countered every tactic, fought with a discipline Rommel had never seen from them before. And there was something else in the report, something that made Rommel pause. The American commander, a general named George Patton. His officers had captured documents from American positions, battle plans, training memoranda, and references, constant references, to a book Rommel himself had written 15 years earlier, Infantry Attacks. Patton had not just read it, he had memorized it. He had taught it to his officers. He had used Rommel's own tactical principles to destroy Rommel's own Afrika Korps. That night, Rommel wrote to Lucy. The letter survives in the German Federal Archives. This is what the Desert Fox confided to his wife, and why it haunted him until the day he died. To understand why Rommel's letter matters, you need to understand what happened at Kasserine Pass, because Kasserine was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation. February 19, 1943, Tunisia. The American Second Corps held positions in the mountains near the Kasserine Pass. They were inexperienced. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their commanders were cautious men, staff officers who had spent the war behind desks. Rommel saw opportunity. He struck at dawn. His panzers poured through the pass. The American lines did not bend, they shattered. In 48 hours, the Germans advanced 85 miles. They destroyed over 200 American tanks. They killed or captured over 6,000 American soldiers. Units broke and ran. Officers abandoned their men. Communication collapsed. It was the worst defeat the United States Army had suffered since the Civil War. Back in Washington, the news hit like a thunderbolt. The American public had been told their boys were winning. Now they learned the truth. Their army had been routed by a German general most Americans had never heard of, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel had earned his legend in North Africa. 2 years of fighting the British across Libya and Egypt, audacious attacks, impossible victories. He had become the most famous German general of the war, and now he had proven that Americans could not stand against him. In his letters to Lucy after Kasserine, Rommel was dismissive. He wrote, "The Americans do not know how to fight. They have equipment but no spirit. Their officers think war is an exercise on paper. They will learn, but the lesson will be painful." Rommel did not know it yet, but the lesson was about to begin, and he would not be the teacher. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, had seen enough. The commanders who had failed at Kasserine were relieved. A new man was needed, someone who could take the shattered Second Corps and turn it into a fighting force. Eisenhower chose George Smith Patton Jr. Patton arrived in Tunisia on March 6, 1943. He came with a simple message for his officers. "We are going to attack and attack and attack, and we are not going to stop until the Germans are destroyed." But Patton knew something his predecessors had not understood. You cannot defeat an enemy you do not know. And Patton knew Rommel. He had been studying him for years. Here is what most people do not know about George Patton. He was a scholar. This seems impossible. The profane, pistol-waving general. The man who slapped soldiers and cursed at chaplains. A scholar, but it is true. Patton had spent his entire career preparing for war. Not just physical preparation. Intellectual preparation. He read military history obsessively. He studied every great commander, Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, Frederick the Great. And in 1937, when a German colonel published a book about infantry tactics, Patton obtained a copy. He had it translated from German to English, and he read it until he could recite passages from memory. The book was called Infantry Infantry Attacks. The author was Erwin Rommel. Rommel had written it about his experiences in World War I. As a young lieutenant, he had led daring attacks in France, Romania, and Italy. The book was not theory, it was practice. Page after page of tactical lessons learned in blood: attack where the enemy is weak, move faster than he can react, strike from unexpected directions, never give him time to recover. These were Rommel's principles, and Patton had memorized every one. When Patton arrived to take command of 2nd Corps, he did not just bring new discipline, he brought a plan. A plan built on knowing exactly how Rommel would fight. Let me tell you what Patton did in his first 10 days in Tunisia. He fired incompetent officers. He imposed brutal standards. Helmets would be worn at all times. Uniforms would be proper. Salutes would be crisp. The soldiers grumbled. They called him a martinet. They said he cared more about dress codes than combat. They were wrong. Patton understood something fundamental. An army that cannot maintain discipline in small things cannot maintain discipline when the shooting starts. Kasserine had proven that. When the panzers came, American units had disintegrated because there was no cohesion, no habits of obedience, no trust between officers and men. Patton built that trust, not with kindness, with standards, but the discipline was only the foundation. The real work happened in Patton's command tent. Night after night, he gathered his officers, and he taught them. He taught them Rommel. According to Colonel Charles Codman, Patton's aide, the general would pace before maps with Rommel's book in his hand. "This is what he will do," Patton would say, pointing to terrain features. "He will probe here, find weakness here, then strike here, because that is what he did at Caporetto, that is what he did at Gazala, that is what he always does." Patton's officers were skeptical at first. How could anyone predict what Rommel would do? But Patton insisted. Rommel had written his playbook. He had published it for the world to read. The fact that no Allied commander had bothered to study it was not Rommel's fault. It was theirs. By mid-March, Patton's 2nd Corps was a different army. Same men who had fled at Kasserine, same tanks, same equipment, but different in every way that mattered. Now they had a commander who understood their enemy, and they had a plan to destroy him. March 23, 1943. El Getter, Tunisia. The sun rose over the desert. American positions stretched along a valley floor, backed against the eastern dorsal mountains. On paper, it looked vulnerable, an exposed force waiting to be flanked. Rommel would have seen it instantly. A classic opportunity for a sweeping panzer attack around the American flank, cutting off retreat, destroying the enemy in detail. But Rommel was not there. He had left Africa 2 weeks earlier, sick and exhausted. Command had passed to General Hans Eugen von Arnim. The Afrika Korps tactics, however, remained pure Rommel: attack the flanks, exploit weakness, never attack strength. Patton was counting on it. He had positioned his forces with exquisite care. The 10th Panzer Division would see what he wanted them to see: an exposed flank, an invitation. It was a trap. At 0600 hours, American artillery opened fire on German positions. The battle had begun. For the first hours, it was an infantry fight. American soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, pushed forward against dug and German defenders. Progress was slow. Casualties mounted. Then the German counterattack came. At 1400 hours, dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Panzers. 50 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division rolling toward the American flank. Exactly as Patton had predicted. You are probably wondering how Patton knew. Let me explain. In Infantry Attacks, Rommel had written extensively about the counterattack. He believed that defense alone was defeat. The only way to win was to strike back hard when the enemy committed himself. The moment of maximum vulnerability was when an attacker had advanced beyond his supply lines. The American attack at El Getter had done exactly that. Patton had pushed forward aggressively, overextending his lines. To German eyes, he was making the same mistakes as Kasserine. But Patton's overextension was calculated. He had hidden his tank destroyers in the wadis, the dry riverbeds that cut across the desert floor, invisible until you were on top of them. The 10th Panzer Division rolled forward, confident. They had broken Americans before. They would break them again. They reached the wadi lines at 14:30 hours, and the desert erupted. M10 tank destroyers opened fire at 800 yards. Their 3-inch guns punched through panzer armor. German tanks began to burn. Crews bilayed out into the sand. The panzer commander tried to flank the American position, but every route was covered, every approach was prepared. There was no weakness because Patton had eliminated weakness. By 1600 hours, the attack had stalled. 30 German tanks were burning. The rest were retreating, but Patton was not finished. He ordered his own tanks forward, not to pursue the retreating panzers, but to strike the German infantry positions while they were undefended, while the panzers were gone. This too came from Rommel's book. In Caporetto, in 1917, Rommel had exploited exactly this moment. When enemy reserves committed to one sector, strike another. Never let the enemy recover his balance. The American Shermans hit the German lines at 1700 hours. Infantry positions that had held all morning collapsed in minutes. By nightfall, the Americans had advanced 3 miles and captured over 1,000 prisoners. March 24th, the Germans attacked again. This time they committed everything: tanks, infantry, artillery. Von Arnim was under pressure from Berlin. He had to break through. He had to prove that the Afrika Korps could still destroy Americans. The attack began at 0800 hours. 60 panzers pushed toward Patton's center. Once again, Patton had prepared. He had reinforced his artillery overnight. Over 40 batteries. When the German tanks entered their range, the American guns opened fire in a coordinated barrage unlike anything the Germans had faced in Africa. The panzers pushed through the artillery, but they were slowed, damaged, disorganized. When they reached the American tank destroyer positions, they were no longer a coordinated force. They were scattered groups of vehicles attacking piecemeal. The tank destroyers picked them apart. By noon, the attack had collapsed. 40 more German tanks destroyed. The 10th Panzer Division had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. But here is what happened next. Something that proved Patton had truly learned from Rommel. March 25th. The Germans expected the Americans to pause, to consolidate, to savor their victory. Patton attacked. At 0600 hours, American forces pushed forward along the entire front. Infantry, tanks, artillery moving in coordinated bounds. The Germans, exhausted from 2 days of failed offensives, could not respond. By nightfall, Patton had advanced 8 miles. He had captured the town of El Getter. He had taken 2,000 more prisoners. In Infantry Attacks, Rommel had written, "The victor must never rest. He must pursue until the enemy breaks, not until the enemy retreats, until he breaks." Patton had read those words 100 times. Now he was living them. Let us talk numbers. Because the numbers at El Getter tell an extraordinary story. In 3 days of fighting, the German forces lost over 100 tanks. They lost 3,000 prisoners. They lost all momentum in Tunisia. American losses, fewer than 30 tanks, around 1,000 casualties, a fraction of what Kasserine had cost. But the numbers do not capture what really changed. At Kasserine, American soldiers had run. At El Getter, they stood. When the panzers came, they held their positions. When the order came to attack, they attacked. The same men, different results. The difference was leadership. The difference was preparation. The difference was a commander who understood his enemy. After the battle, Patton gathered his officers. According to witnesses, he said only a few words. "Rommel should have read my book. It was a joke." Patton had not written a book, but everyone in that room understood what he meant. He had taken Rommel's own doctrine and turned it against Rommel's own army. The legend of the American victory at El Gueter spread quickly. Within days, every soldier in Tunisia knew the story. The old man had beaten Rommel. The desert fox had met his match, but there is something most histories leave out. Rommel was not at El Gueter. He had left Africa on March 9th, 2 weeks before the battle. He was in that hospital in Austria, recovering from exhaustion and depression. So how did he learn what had happened? His staff officers wrote to him. They sent detailed reports, and in those reports they included something remarkable: captured American documents that revealed how Patton had prepared for battle, training manuals that quoted infantry attacks directly, staff memoranda that analyzed Rommel's tactics, battle plans that anticipated German moves with uncanny accuracy. Rommel read these reports and he understood. He had been beaten by his own words. March 26, 1943, Semmering, Austria. Rommel sat alone in his hospital room. The reports from Tunisia were spread across his bed. Maps, casualty figures, the captured American documents he had spent the morning reading. Now he was writing. His letters to Lucy were his refuge. Throughout the war he had written to her constantly, sharing his triumphs, confessing his doubts, saying things he could never say to his officers or to Berlin. The letter he wrote that night survives in the collection of Rommel papers held by the German Federal Archives and later published by his son Manfred. Rommel wrote about the American victory at El Gueter. He wrote about the change he saw in the reports. And then he wrote something remarkable. According to the published papers, Rommel told Lucy, "The Americans have found a general who understands war. Not the war they taught at West Point. Real war. He has read my book. He has understood it better than my own officers. This Patton fights the way I fight. He attacks when others defend. He takes risks that seem foolish until they succeed. I do not know if we can beat such a man. There is more." In subsequent letters, as reports from Tunisia continued to arrive, Rommel returned to this theme again and again. The Americans were learning. They were adapting. They were becoming the soldiers he had dismissed at Kasserine. On April 3rd, he wrote, "The Desert Fox may have met his match. Not in machines. The Shermans are still inferior, but in mind. Patton thinks, he studies, he prepares. These are things our young officers no longer do. They believe courage is enough. It is not." This admission is extraordinary when you understand Rommel's character. He was not a modest man. He cultivated his legend. He enjoyed his fame. He believed, with some justification, that he was the finest tactical commander of his generation. To admit, even privately, that an American general had outthought him was an act of profound honesty, and perhaps the beginning of Rommel's disillusionment with the German war effort, because Rommel saw something in Patton that he no longer saw in the German army: a commander who studied, who prepared, who respected his enemy enough to learn from him. The German generals of 1943 had become arrogant. They believed their early victories had proven German superiority. They stopped learning. They stopped adapting. Patton never stopped learning. He read Rommel's book in 1937. He was still studying it in 1943, and he would continue studying it until the end of the war. Rommel recognized this, and it frightened him. In one of his last letters before returning to duty, Rommel wrote to Lucy, "I taught my enemies how to beat me. I put it in a book and they read it. What kind of fool does such a thing?" He was being too hard on himself. Writing Infantry Attacks had not been foolish. It had been generous. A professional soldier sharing his knowledge with the next generation. The foolishness was assuming that only Germans would read it. You are probably wondering why a letter to a wife matters 80 years later. Let me explain. The intellectual duel between Patton and Rommel became one of the most studied command rivalries in military history, not because of their battles, because of their minds. Both men believed that war was an art, that tactics could be taught but genius could not, that the great commander was the one who saw what others missed and acted while others hesitated. But they approached this art differently. Rommel trusted intuition. He made decisions in the moment based on what he saw and felt. His book was a record of those decisions, brilliant improvisations captured on the page. Patton trusted preparation. He studied every great commander who had ever lived. He memorized their battles. He analyzed their decisions. And when his moment came, he drew on that vast reservoir of knowledge. At Algetter, preparation beat intuition. This lesson has been studied at every major military academy since World War II. The United States Army War College, the British Staff College at Camberley, even the German Bundeswehr School. The lesson is simple: know your enemy, not just his equipment, not just his position, his mind, his habits, his doctrine. Read what he has written, study what he has done, understand how he thinks. Then use that understanding to destroy him. Modern military doctrine calls this red teaming. Intelligence analysts try to think like the enemy. Staff officers study enemy tactics. Commanders immerse themselves in enemy culture and history. All of this traces back to Patton standing in his tent in Tunisia, reading Infantry Attacks by flashlight. But there is a deeper lesson in the Patton Rommel story, one that goes beyond tactics. Both men respected each other. They never met. They never spoke. But through their actions, they conducted a dialogue, each responding to the other, each learning from the other. Rommel's letters to Lucy make this clear. He did not hate Patton. He admired him. He recognized in Patton the same qualities he valued in himself: aggression, audacity, the willingness to risk everything on a single throw. After the war, when Patton learned of Rommel's death, he was reportedly silent for a long time. Then he said he was the best they had, and we killed him. Patton did not know the full truth. Rommel had been forced to commit suicide for his suspected involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler. But Patton's reaction reveals something important. Warriors recognize each other, even across the battle lines. The cost of war is not just measured in casualties. It is measured in the loss of men who, in another world, might have been friends. Rommel and Patton would have understood each other perfectly. Instead, they destroyed each other's armies. This is the tragedy at the heart of the greatest intellectual rivalry of World War II. In March of 1943, an American general proved that reading could win battles. George Patton took a beaten army and transformed it. He studied his enemy until he knew him better than the enemy knew himself. And when the panzers came at Algetter, he was ready. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the legend of North Africa, wrote to his wife in astonishment. He had been beaten by his own words, his own tactics, his own book. Patton would go on to become the most famous American general of the war. Rommel would be dead within 18 months, forced to choose between trial and poison. But in those letters to Lucy, we see something remarkable. A moment of genuine respect between enemies. A warrior acknowledging that he had found his equal. Subscribe for more untold stories from the greatest conflict in human history. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching.